All right, folks, showtime.
Since the formation of the country, economic and political differences had been threatening the union of northern states and southern states. During the 1800s, the United States was becoming a diverse country, and it was growing rapidly. It was a time of great westward expansion. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States and opened up vast expanses of land for pioneer settlement. The Lewis and Clark expedition of 1803 blazed a trail to the west coast. This led the way for the pioneers to follow. The pioneers were leaving small farms and crowded cities. They were seeking cheap or free land to call their own. They followed the Oregon Trail and several other trails west. Their journey, by covered wagon, lasted several months. This westward migration became much faster and easier when the railroad connected the east to the west. Many people migrated west, but the greater population remained in the east. In the eastern part of the country, there were growing differences between the northern states and the southern states. These differences were over politics, economics, and the problem of slavery. These issues led to the Civil War. During the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution attracted people from the farms to the city, where they could find work in manufacturing. Most of these jobs were in the north because 80% of the country's factories were located in its large industrial cities. These new workers dramatically increased the population of the north. Northerners controlled most of the railroads in the country. This made it easy for the north to trade goods and crops with the west and with the south. They also built canals to move food and resources into the cities and to ship their manufactured products to markets in other regions. The North was a place where wealth was greatly concentrated. The North controlled most of the banks. This meant that Southerners had to borrow money from Northerners. The Southern states were agricultural. Most of the people in the South were farmers. They raised cash crops for money. Their crops were sold in the northern states and to Europe. They sold crops like rice, tobacco, and sugarcane. However, it was cotton that made southern plantation owners wealthy. The majority of the world's raw cotton came from the South. There were many disagreements between the North and the South. It was becoming clear that the nation was divided both economically and politically. One of the main economic issues was a tariff or tax charged on all imported European goods. This made European goods much more expensive than those made in the United States. Congress passed the tariff to encourage the South to buy goods from the North and not from Europe. This made the South economically dependent on the North because they bought their manufactured goods from them. Senator John Calhoun was from the South, and he argued that Congress did not have the right to use a tariff to protect the manufacturing industry of the North at the cost of the agricultural sector of the South. Another economic issue was slavery. Slaves are people who are owned by other people and are forced to do work for them without pay. The South, with its large plantations, had become dependent on the free labor of African slaves. This slave labor allowed some Southern plantation owners to become quite wealthy. The slaves worked the fields and performed household chores. Others learned trades and were hired out, their earnings going to their owners. Many people in the North believed that slavery was wrong. They were working to stop the spread of slavery or abolish it completely. Politically, the northern states with their large industrial cities were gaining more power in the federal government. The North's growing population meant more representation in Congress. The South was concerned that the North would eventually control Congress and the laws they passed. Also, the South didn't want a powerful federal government. They wanted each state to set its own laws. This is called states' rights. The issue of power in Congress was addressed in many compromises. When a new state wanted to be admitted to the Union, it had to decide whether it would be a free state and add to Northern power in the Congress, or a slave state and add to Southern power or control of the Congress. The compromises were meant to ease the growing tension between the North and the South. In 1820, Henry Clay, a Kentucky senator, persuaded Congress to pass the Missouri Compromise. This law prohibited slavery in the lands of the Louisiana Purchase, north of Missouri's southern border. In 1849, California asked to be admitted to the Union as a free state. This would have upset the power balance in the Senate of 15 free states and 15 slave states. After much debate, a new compromise was adopted. It was called the Compromise of 1850. Under the compromise, California was admitted as a free state. Also, the territories of New Mexico and Utah were given the right to decide if they wanted to be free or slave states. This compromise also gave the South a tougher fugitive slave law. This made it more difficult for slaves that escaped north to stay free. In addition, slave trade was forbidden in the District of Columbia. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act gave the people in both territories the power to decide for themselves if they were to become free states or slave states. This led to a great deal of violence, as both Northerners and Southerners fought to gain control of the territories. In 1857, Dred Scott, a slave, argued for his freedom before the Supreme Court. He said he should be free because he and his owner had once lived in free states. The Supreme Court did not give Dred Scott his freedom. They said that he was not a citizen and therefore not allowed to sue in federal courts. In addition, they decided that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and that Congress had no right to exclude slavery from a territory. This decision enraged the people of the North, while Southerners rejoiced. Most Northerners wanted to limit the spread of slavery. Some people wanted slavery abolished. These people were known as abolitionists. In the early 1800s, there were many anti-slavery organizations. The South was angered by these groups. They believed that abolition would destroy their economy. Frederick Douglass was an active abolitionist. He escaped from Southern slavery and went north to live. There he made speeches and wrote articles against slavery. He believed that all people were equal and should be treated equal under the law. Other leading abolitionists were William Lloyd Garrison, who published the newspaper called The Liberator, and Sojourner Truth. She was a former slave who gave speeches on equality and abolition. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. This book made many people in the United States and Europe aware of the poor treatment of the slaves in the South. All of these abolitionists believed it was wrong to own another human being. Some of the abolitionists established what was called the Underground Railroad. It was not underground, nor was it a railroad. It consisted of groups of people who worked together to secretly escort Southern slaves from the South to freedom in the North. Harriet Tubman, an escaped slave, was a guide or conductor on the Underground Railroad. During the 1850s, she made 19 trips from the South to the North, leading more than 300 people to freedom. One abolitionist, John Brown, had a plan to give guns to slaves so they could fight for their freedom. He and a small group of followers seized a weapons storehouse in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. His plan failed when local militia and federal troops stopped them. Some slaves, such as Nat Turner, started uprisings on their own, but these also failed. The Civil War had many causes. There were the economic issues of tariffs and Northern control of railroads and banks. Political issues of states' rights and who controlled the Congress, and the heated issue of slavery. As the presidential election of 1860 approached, Southerners feared losing control to a Northerner. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a Northerner, was elected President of the United States. He believed in a strong central government making laws for the states. This meant the states would have less power than the federal government. He wanted to keep the country united, and he wanted to stop the spread of slavery. This was more than the Southern states could endure, so they began to secede or leave the Union. South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union in December of 1860. Over the next 6 weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas left the Union. They formed their own country called the Confederate States of America, and they elected Jefferson Davis as the president of the Confederacy. The North said that secession was unconstitutional, and they were ready to use military force to keep the South in the Union. In April of 1861, the new Confederate government demanded that Union soldiers leave Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Union forces refused to leave. The Confederates answered with cannon fire, and the Civil War began.
For more great curriculum-coordinated programs, call 1-800-483-3383 or visit us online at schoolvideos.com.